When you shut your eyes and try to picture Antarctica, chances are the first thing that comes to mind is an endless sheet of ice. Maybe with a few penguins waddling around, and if you stretch your imagination further, all you'll probably add is even more ice. That S because the continent alone holds nearly 90% of the Earth's entire glacial ice. In many regions, the ice layer ice and tea just thick. It's miles or kilometers deep. For most people, Antarctica has always been this way, and they assume it will always stay this way. But that's actually a misconception. Believe it or not, there was once a time when Antarctica wasn't frozen at all. Instead, it was covered in lush forests, teeming with strange wildlife, and destined for a rather tragic fate. A true lost world, in every sense. Today, Antarctica stands alone at the bottom of the globe, the most isolated of the 7 continents, with no natural borders touching others. But that wasn't always the case. In the distant past, the continent sat further north, closer to its neighbors. And for millions of years it was directly connected to South America and Australia, or at the very least, linked to them through land bridges. This connection made Antarctica a natural crossroads for countless species. Dinosaurs in particular used it as a passageway, something scientists know thanks to nearly identical fossil skulls discovered in South America, Australia, and Antarctica itself. These finds suggest that animals freely roamed between the three. Some even chose to settle permanently in Antarctica, because back then the climate was far more forgiving. During the Mesozoic era, Antarctica's position further north and the generally warmer global climate gave the continent an average temperature of around 12 degrees Celsius, 53 degrees Fahrenheit. In the Cretaceous period, that's warmer than many places in Europe today, even warmer than modern-day Germany, for example. As a result, Antarctica was far from the icy desert we think of now. Instead, it was home to a remarkable variety of dinosaurs, theropods, ankylosaurs, hadrosaurs, and sauropods all roamed its land, while its surrounding seas swarmed with sharks and massive marine reptiles. Thanks to plentiful rainfall and a much milder climate, Antarctica's surface was blanketed in vibrant green. Dense rainforests thrived, filled with conifers, ferns, flowering plants, and ginkgo trees. If you had been there, you'd never have guessed you were standing on the same continent we know today. Of course, we don't see dinosaurs wandering Antarctica anymore. And there's a reason for that. Like the rest of the planet, Antarctica was devastated by the asteroid impact that ended the reign of the dinosaurs. The collision unleashed catastrophic events worldwide. A massive tsunami likely slammed into Antarctica's coasts, while heat and firestorms scorched the land and enormous wildfires ripped through its forests. Even after the flames died out, the aftermath was brutal. Dust, ash, and sulfur filled the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and plunging the Earth into a long, dark, cold spell. Much of the world froze, and Antarctica along with it. But here's where the story surprises most people. Antarctica didn't stay frozen right away, nor did it remain permanently lifeless after the dinosaurs disappeared. In fact, after the initial chaos, the continent bounced back. Life returned, and Antarctica went on to experience one of the most biologically rich periods in its entire history. Despite the assumption that the Cenozoic, the current geological era, has always been cold, Antarctica during parts of it was shockingly warm. In fact, at times, it may have been even hotter than it was during the age of dinosaurs, minus the asteroid disaster, of course. This dramatic warming was triggered by a greenhouse world. After the end of the Cretaceous, large amounts of carbon dioxide began accumulating in the atmosphere, though exactly where it all came from is still debated. The result was a sharp rise in global temperatures. During the Paleocene and Eocene epochs, the Earth grew far hotter than it is today. At the peak of this warming, during an event called the Eocene thermal maximum, the planet reached its highest temperatures in the last 100 million years. Antarctica itself, even though it had drifted further south by then, enjoyed average temperatures around 25 degrees Celsius, 77 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that into perspective, that's about as warm as modern-day Kenya, because Antarctica was still sitting around 60 south latitude at that point. Not as far south as today. Its climate was even more favorable to life. Plants that couldn't survive there now thrived across the land. If you had been stranded in Antarctica during the Paleogene period, you wouldn't have seen ice at all. Instead, palm trees swayed in the wind, swamps and wetlands spread across the landscape, and crocodile-like creatures lounged in rivers. It would have felt less like Antarctica and more like a tropical island paradise. Now, before you start imagining this so-called lost world as some kind of paradise, let me lower your expectations a little. Surviving in ancient Antarctica wasn't exactly easy. It wasn't an endless sheet of ice like today, sure, but it came with its own set of terrifying challenges. At present, the largest land creature you'll find in Antarctica is laughably small. In fact, it's just a flightless insect, no bigger than an ant. Not very intimidating, right? But if you rewind millions of years, things were very different. Back then, one of the top predators stalking the continent wasn't a mammal, wasn't a reptile, it was a bird. And not just any bird, but a towering terror bird, part of a group formerly called Ferishratids. You might be scratching your head here because these birds are usually associated with South America. And you'd be right, that's where they flourished. But during those ancient days, Antarctica wasn't cut off. Land bridges still occasionally linked it to South America, and those connections remained until about 40 million years ago. That pathway gave terror birds the chance to march south and establish themselves in Antarctica, where they became apex hunters. These creatures weren't your average birds. They were built like feathered nightmares. Standing as tall as a grown human, armed with massive hooked beaks strong enough to tear flesh apart, and legs ending in powerful claws, capable of pinning victims to the ground. The particular species found in Antarctica is still unnamed, but evidence suggests it was closely related to Pherusarosus, one of the largest and most aggressive members of the family. But this raises an interesting question. What exactly were these giant carnivorous birds eating? After all, today the only permanent residents of Antarctica are small insects. The answer lies in the same land bridges that brought them south. Those passages also carried over a variety of mammals from South America, whose fossils have been discovered in the La Meseta Formation on Seymour Island. While these animals didn't all live there simultaneously, the fossil record paints a vivid picture of the wildlife that once thrived on the continent. Among the most notable were members of an extinct group known as the Astropatheria, plant-eating mammals that somewhat resembled primitive rhinos. Two species in particular have been confirmed from Antarctica: Trigonostolops and Antertodon. Their sizes varied greatly, with some being no larger than a pangolin, while others may have reached weights close to half a ton, though that estimate remains debated. Another heavyweight herbivore of the region was Nodialephus, belonging to a separate order of extinct ungulates called litopterns. Adults could reach about 400 kilograms, 880 pounds, similar in bulk to a modern muskox. These large mammals most likely thrived on the nutrient-rich flowering plants that blanketed Antarctica during its warmer ages. Not all the litopterns were hulking giants, though. One smaller and particularly peculiar species, Victor Lemoynia, sported unusual nasal openings high up on its skull. Some paleontologists suggest it may have had a short trunk, similar to a tapir, to help it grab vegetation. Others think it may have possessed fleshy prehensile lips like a moose, or even a strange, flexible nose akin to a saiga antelope's, which would have helped it regulate temperature and filter dust. Whatever the case, it was a bizarre adaptation that highlights just how diverse life was in ancient Antarctica. Beyond these larger herbivores, the continent hosted a whole assortment of smaller mammals. Among them were early Gondwanatheres, odd rodent-like creatures with oversized teeth that earned them the nicknames saber-toothed squirrels. Despite their fearsome name, they were primarily insect eaters and may have been some of the earliest mammals to settle Antarctica, surviving even the extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs. Their small size and flexible diets likely helped them persist through tough times. Then there were the marsupials. When you think of marsupials, images of kangaroos, koalas, or possums from Australia probably spring to mind. But their roots actually trace back to South America. Because of Antarctica's land connections, marsupials crossed through and temporarily flourished there before eventually spreading into Australia. Fossils suggest at least 3 groups managed to colonize the icy continent: the enigmatic Didelphimorphia, the diverse Polydolopyrophia, and the Microbiotheria. Of these, only the last group has a living descendant, the Monito del Monte, or little monkey of the mountain, which survives today in Chile and Argentina. Interestingly, genetic studies show it's more closely related to Australian marsupials than to other South American ones, highlighting Antarctica's crucial role as a bridge in their evolutionary journey. So with herds of herbivorous ungulates, rodent-like insectivores, and marsupials roaming the forests and wetlands, terror birds had no shortage of prey. But they weren't the only predators making life dangerous. Another unexpected carnivore prowled the region, not on land, but in the water. Fossil evidence reveals that crocodilians once inhabited Antarctica too. For decades, paleontologists suspected this because of the warm climate and land bridges. But solid proof didn't emerge until the discovery of a massive bony plate, or osteoderm, dated to the Eocene. This fossil matched those of both ancient and modern crocodiles. And this wasn't a small specimen either. Judging by the osteoderm's proportions, this crocodile could have reached about 7 meters, 23 feet long, roughly 15% bigger than the largest saltwater crocodiles alive today. That would make it one of the deadliest animals in Antarctica's history, and technically the true top predator of the land during that era. If we turn our attention to the waters of ancient Antarctica, the picture becomes even more intense. The crocodilian species that lurked here were most likely ambush predators, using patience and stealth to strike with devastating force. Much like modern saltwater crocodiles, they may have thrived in rivers, brackish estuaries, and even ventured into coastal seas. That meant no creature was ever completely safe when approaching the water's edge. Their enormous size alone meant that nearly anything they encountered could end up on the menu. And fascinatingly, the evidence shows they weren't the only ones. Fossil finds from nearby areas hint at the presence of other crocodile lineages, or specialized forms with adaptations suggesting unique diets. While details remain scarce, the implication is clear. When Antarctica was lush and green, crocodiles of different kinds haunted its waterways. And almost every other animal living there would have had to face the constant risk of ending up in their jaws. Even penguins, surprisingly, were not immune. And yes, penguins were already there. Many people assume penguins are creatures of the cold, but their evolutionary story actually begins in warmer regions. Around 60 million years ago, early penguins are thought to have originated off the coasts of New Zealand and southern Australia, eventually spreading to Antarctica where they flourished. If you think Antarctica is a penguin stronghold today, with just 2 species that live there year-round, then back in the Paleogene it was a veritable penguin empire. As many as 16 distinct species waddled across its shores. What's even more astonishing is their size and variety. While today, S. emperor penguin is considered impressive at about 45 kilograms, 100 pounds, and nearly 1.5 meters, 4 feet 11 inches. Tall, some of their prehistoric relatives made them look like dwarves. Species such as Anthropornis and Palladips reach staggering sizes. At full height, they could stand more than 2 meters tall, taller than basketball legend Michael Jordan, and weighed well over 100 kilograms. To put it simply, these were penguins bigger than a jaguar. And being struck by one of their flippers probably felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. These giants were not only massive but highly capable hunters in the sea. They may have been able to stay submerged for 40 minutes or more, giving them plenty of time to ambush squid, fish, and krill in vast numbers. Their enormous size might have been an evolutionary trick to conserve energy in colder waters, yet even their bulk was no guarantee of safety. In those ancient seas, danger lurked everywhere, because sharing those waters were other monsters equally, if not more frightening. Whales lived in Antarctica then as well, but they were very different from the ones we know today. Fossils from the Lama Seta Formation tell us that at least two genera of early whales prowled its oceans during the Paleogene. The first belonged to the basilosaurids, long, serpent-like whales with enormous jaws and sharp teeth. They were specialized for hunting in shallow seas, and their skulls were built to crush through flesh and bone alike. A partial mandible suggests one species could have reached lengths of up to 12 meters, 40 feet. With a mouth that size, its diet could have included fish, smaller marine mammals, penguins, and even massive sea turtles, some of which grew up to 3 meters 10 feet long, far surpassing any living turtle species today. But the basilosaurids weren't the only giants around. Another whale, known as Lanocetus, swam these same waters. Its fossils are particularly striking because the remains we have are from a juvenile, and yet it was already about the size of a modern orca. That raises a chilling possibility. Adults could have grown as large as today's humpback whales, if not bigger. And while it belonged to the baleen lineage, Lanocetus still had teeth. This means it may have combined suction feeding with active predation, giving it a highly varied diet. Fish, penguins, small mammals, even sharks. Almost anything in its environment could have ended up as prey. Evidence suggests it lived both in coastal river deltas and in the open sea, making it a true terror wherever it roamed.
Ow.
And yes, sharks were everywhere. Unlike today, where Antarctic waters host just a handful of species, the Paleogene seas were bursting with them. In many ways, it was like the Australia of the South, absolutely packed with predators. The list of sharks that prowled those waters is dizzying. Requiem sharks, goblin sharks, gulper sharks, carpet sharks, kitefin, sharks longnose, sharks seven-goal, and six-gill sharks, hound sharks, poor beagles, smooth hounds, sand angels, and saw sharks. And that still doesn't cover them all. Among this extensive lineup, there were three especially remarkable kinds. One was an extinct species of basking shark, filter feeding its way through plankton-rich seas. Another was the ancestor of today's mako sharks, already a swift and efficient hunter. And finally, the most infamous of all, the earliest relatives of Megalodon. Yes, the colossal shark, that would later become one of the most terrifying marine predators in Earth's history, had its origins tied, in part, to environments like prehistoric Antarctica. So, between giant crocodiles ambushing from rivers, oversized penguins dominating the coasts, whale-like serpents hunting in shallow waters, colossal toothed baleen whales feeding offshore, and seas brimming with sharks, ancient Antarctica was anything but the frozen desert we picture today. It was a kingdom of giants and predators, a place where almost no creature, no matter how big, was truly safe. Now, to be precise, not talking about the full-grown megalodon itself, but rather two of its close relatives that belonged to the very same genus, Otodus, whose name fittingly translates to ear-shaped tooth. Fossil evidence tells us that Otodus suavis and Otodus auriculatus patrolled the coastal waters of Antarctica, serving as apex hunters in their time. Their enormous size meant they likely clashed with the giant whales that shared their seas. The smaller of the two, O. suavis, was still a formidable predator. With teeth showing finer serrations than most Otodus species, it regularly reached lengths of 6 meters, about 20 feet. That made it roughly the size of today's largest great white sharks. But its larger cousin, O. auriculatus, dwarfed it. The biggest known individuals stretched to nearly 9.5 meters, 31 feet long. While it never quite reached the monstrous proportions of its descendant, the megalodon, it was still massive enough to dominate its environment. Based on what we know about the genus as a whole, both of these Antarctic giants would have fed on fish, turtles, smaller sharks, and possibly even whales. Together with the many other sharks in those waters, they turned prehistoric Antarctica into a perilous place for penguins, mammals, and just about everything else swimming nearby. And penguins weren't the only birds living dangerously back then. In fact, the fossil record suggests that Antarctica played a surprisingly important role in bird evolution. Some paleontologists even argue that the very first truly modern bird species may have emerged there. One candidate, known as Vegavus, lived on the continent near the end of the Cretaceous. Although it didn't survive past that era, its discovery demonstrates just how significant Antarctica was for the history of birds. What's more, It's possible that Antarctica itself served as something of a refuge for avian species after the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs. This could explain why bird fossils from the region are so numerous and diverse. The Paleogene, groups such as falcons, ibises, albatrosses, and petrels were all established there. But perhaps the strangest bird of them all was D. sornis. The sornis belonged to the Palagornithidae, a family of birds often nicknamed bony-toothed birds. They didn't actually have teeth, but their beaks sprouted rows of bony projections that looked eerily like them, giving the animals a somewhat monstrous grin. If that wasn't unusual enough, D. sornis was truly enormous. With a wingspan of 5 to 6 meters, 16 to 20 feet, it rivaled small airplanes in size. Or, if you prefer prehistoric comparisons, it was about as wide as a pteranodon. In spite of its intimidating appearance, though, D. sornis wasn't much of a killer. Its fragile skeleton suggests it wasn't built for grappling with large prey. Instead, it likely specialized in skimming across the ocean's surface, snapping up fish and squid that strayed too close. All in all, before Antarctica froze, it was a thriving and chaotic land of giants, strange predators, and astonishing birds. Which brings us to the big question: what happened to it all? Where did this incredible world go? Fortunately, the answer is a tragic one. Most of these unique creatures were wiped out as Antarctica's paradise crumbled during the final stretch of the Eocene epoch. If you had been standing on the continent at that time, survival would have been grimly unlikely. A cascade of events unfolded, and almost all of them spelled disaster. The timeline is still debated, but it likely began when Antarctica finally split apart from its neighboring continents. This opened up the Drake Passage between it and South America, as well as the Tasmanian Passage with Australia. That isolation trapped the animals living there, cutting them off from outside ecosystems. Alone, this wasn't necessarily fatal. Antarctica is vast after all, but it set the stage for something far worse. For more than 200 million years, Earth's climate had stayed generally warm, sometimes even sweltering. Then, about 34 million years ago, things shifted dramatically. Temperatures began to fall, sharply. Ironically, this was due in large part to Antarctica's own isolation. The opening of those new ocean gateways triggered the formation of the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a powerful flow of cold water that still circles the continent today. This current blocked warm waters from reaching its shores and also drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, intensifying the cooling effect. As the continent continued drifting south, ice began to accumulate. Vast ice sheets appeared, marking the beginning of the late Eocene glaciation, effectively the birth of the ice age that we technically still live in today. The sudden plunge in temperature destroyed ecosystems that had flourished for tens of millions of years. Animals simply couldn't adapt fast enough. Habitats shrank and vanished, and one by one, the unique species that had defined Antarctica's green world disappeared. Some survivors may have lingered in small refuges where ice hadn't yet reached, but their respite was temporary. Over the next 7 million years, glaciers spread across the land until they blanketed nearly the entire continent. And to make matters worse, the very presence of so much ice only deepened the cold. Ice sheets reflect sunlight back into space, amplifying the chill and locking Antarctica into a frozen state. That's the condition we see today, a land almost entirely buried under ice, largely lifeless compared to its once rich past. While we do have remarkable fossil beds like the La Meseta Formation that offer glimpses into this lost world, the truth is, we still dan. Do you know what other secrets remain buried beneath Antarctica's thick frozen crust? Unlocking them would require drilling deep into an unforgiving environment, a challenge that may remain unsolved for generations. And so, the story of Antarctica is one of transformation. From a lush, vibrant wilderness full of giants, predators, and evolutionary marvels, to the cold, desolate desert of ice we know now. Paradise turned prison, a kingdom of life lost beneath eternal frost.